Profiles and Issues is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It is a show that profiles people and issues that affect the church in the modern world. Your program host is Father James Corda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Profiles and Issues. I'm Father Jim Corda. Our issue today is Women in the New Testament. To help me profile the issue is Sister Lisa Marie Belts. Welcome to our show today.
Hi, Father. I'm delighted to be here.
What exactly does the New Testament tell us about women?
Well, it actually says a number of interesting things that are easy to look up unless you know the historical context. So one thing we know about the New Testament is that it respects the leadership of women. It respects the role of women. We see right away, for example, at the very beginning of Luke's gospel, women presented as prophets. So Mary, Jesus' mother, her Magnificat is something that is presented as a parallel to Miriam, the prophet's great song in Exodus 15. And of course, Hannah, who's the mother of the prophet Samuel, and her hymn of praise. And so there are allusions to these women from, we might say, the First Testament scriptures. It's another way of referring to the Old Testament. And Mary is very much within that role of a prophetess. She's filled with the Holy Spirit. These are women then who are able to give birth. Well, Mary is able, she gives birth to the Christ through the agency of the Spirit. And Elizabeth too is filled with the Holy Spirit with the greeting with Mary. And so the role of women altogether in the New Testament is one which respects their place. It respects the work of God in their life. And then we see in Paul's letters, especially Romans 16, gives us a very interesting insight into women in the early church. And Paul's recognition of their gifts that they bring to leadership in early Christian communities.
It's interesting because when we think of Paul and women, a lot of times we have this myth that Paul did not like women, but in fact that was not the reality.
No, as a matter of fact, now here's what's happened in recent years, and thanks to documents that the Church has put out since really 1943, Divino Flaunti Spiritu. Divino Flaunti Spiritu said to biblical scholars, you have to look at the historical context. There are other ways of reading Scripture, yes, but you have to begin with the historical context. Tell us what that historical context is. The second thing that Divino Flaunti Spiritu does for us is to say, you have to tell us what is the most original version of this before later scribes and copyists change it. Because we know that this is a fact of literary history. As scribes copied by hand, they would reinterpret the text, and their reinterpretations would change it. And that's what we see going on with Paul's letters. And there are actually scientific ways of evaluating how all of that is done. And when we look at Paul's context, his historical context, when we apply various scientific analyses to Paul's letters, what we see going on with Paul's letters is the same thing that goes on in ancient manuscripts across the board, whether from the Dead Sea Scrolls or from classical Greco-Roman authors like Cicero or Seneca, that later scribes and copyists will tweak them a little bit. And Paul definitely gets tweaked. Why does he get tweaked? Basically to conform what he says about women to Roman ideas and Roman ideals regarding the role of women, the proper place of women in the household.
Let's talk about the placement of women historically in biblical times. What was their role? Sometimes it wasn't always one of prominence, but it was linked to a husband, for example.
Well, now here's, right, a husband. Now this is important because what we want to realize when we're talking about the ancient world is that the average lifespan was around 40. Now, yes, there were people who lived longer than that, but many did not. We are talking about a population around the Mediterranean world and the ancient Near East only in the millions. You know, we don't reach 1 billion people in global population until 1800. And so what that means is that every young person is called upon to fulfill their biological duty. Every young man, every young woman is called upon to fulfill their biological duty. So it's not like today, you know, where young people can choose whom they would marry. In the ancient world, marriages would be arranged. And so you will have a young man, you will arrange a marriage for your daughter to a young man because you want her to have, you know, a good life. And, you know, a family with a son will want a good wife for their son. And so parents would plan marriages that way. So yes, women would be married, but then, you know, you could say men would be married as well.
Sure.
So that's not so unusual.
What about widows in the scriptures, the importance of them? Obviously, in the Old Testament, we hear lots about widows and orphans.
That's
but
right.
what about in New Testament times? What exactly does the Bible say about them?
Well, this is in Paul. Here is where Paul is absolutely phenomenal. Now, we find Paul's instructions on widows in 1 Corinthians 7. And here's what he has to say that you don't expect. He says, in the Greek text, when you read it in the Greek, it's a bit cleaned up in English. He says, well, you know, widows might be actually happier if they don't remarry. I would recommend that they not remarry. They might even be happier that way. Now, there are a number of reasons why he would say that, but I also think he sees women as having a role, contribution to make, which, like the men of his time, doesn't have to be directly linked to family. And so when he says that young women, and he uses the word parthenoi, which can mean young women, and the implication is that these are women without sexual experience. They're unmarried women. So, you know, that word will get translated as virgins, but it basically means young unmarried women when he uses that word parthenoi. And so he uses two categories here: unmarried women who have never been married, and women who have been married and who are not now any longer. Either their husband died, or the category of widows can also include divorced women. You know, and so he is the first one ever to say outright, that we have this in the literary record, to say outright that women do not have to remarry. And what's so significant about that are two things. And the first is, Caesar Augustus had a law saying that all widows and widowers had to be remarried within a few years because he was so concerned about population. He was concerned that there was a population decline, and if you don't marry and have children, then you are putting society at risk. There was a sense that they were only one epidemic away from total societal chaos. And that's why everyone was called upon to do their biological duty. And Paul is taking a route that we see in some Cynic philosophers. Cynic philosophers said that men might choose a life of philosophical contemplation, that the wise man, the sage, can choose a life of philosophical contemplation in such a way that he doesn't have to marry, that philosophical contemplation is above even marriage. And we see this in Epictetus, for example, a first century Roman philosopher. He says, "Am I not free? I have no wife, I have no children, I have no links to family, and I am now totally free to devote myself to philosophical contemplation." Paul applies that now to women. He is the first to do so. And that's significant. And it's only then, once 1 Corinthians 7 becomes widely read in the Mediterranean world, that you see a change in status in women, where Christian women may choose not to marry, and that's acceptable.
We're down to the last few minutes of our first segment. What I'd like to ask you to briefly mention is why are some women named in the New Testament, and then many are unnamed? Is there a reason why some are and some aren't?
There is, and that's a great question. First of all, it's out of respect for them. It's this cultural idea that a woman cannot be exposed to the male gaze. And so that also is included in literature. You won't mention the name. And if she is named, it might suggest that she's no longer alive.
One woman that's kind of fascinating, I think, for many young women, especially young brides, is the Bride of Cana. You know, we know that this was Jesus's first sign in Cana of the Galilee. We just know about the situation of turning water into wine. What's so significant about the Bride of Cana, and maybe why isn't she mentioned?
Out of respect for her and her place. We see this in the literary record. When a woman is talked about, so there's an example, for example, in Roman literature, when a proud husband describes his wonderful wife, and she's good at everything, and she manages the household so well, and she's so faithful to him, and she loves him, and he loves her, and then you see someone trying to test that, and he will actually go and violate this woman. That the Romans were so paranoid. That culture at that time was so paranoid about women that in order to protect them, you don't mention them by name. You don't expose them to unwanted male attention.
Now we know that Mary obviously is very central in the New Testament, but there's just certain areas of the life and events that surround Jesus where she's mentioned.
That's
and
right.
not in many and varied ways, but in specific ways. Is there a reason?
Is there a reason for that? Well, how about in John's Gospel, this beautiful figure of Mary, saying at the wedding feast of Cana, do whatever he tells you. She's taking control of the situation, and that's acceptable. She's not taking no for an answer. So Jesus is a little bit reluctant to do anything. Well, why is this a problem for me to solve? It's basically what he's saying to her. And she won't take that as an answer. She just goes right to the servants and do whatever he tells you. So she has a very gentle way of, in a sense, taking charge because she's concerned. As a mother, she's concerned about this young couple who are facing a very embarrassing situation.
And I've often thought about that particular miracle myself, because most of the miracles of Jesus meet some particular human need.
Right.
Raising the dead, feeding the hungry, curing the sick. But that's the one miracle that really doesn't solve anything other than bringing some joy to what could have been a very unhappy situation.
Well, and it would have been a very embarrassing situation. And when you read in between the lines, what the text tells us is that Jesus brought his 12 disciples with him. Now, this is speculation, but it could be Mary saying, you brought your friends along, and because you brought your friends along, they don't have enough wine, so do something about it.
We're going to talk in a few minutes after we take a break specifically about some of the women, not only in the New Testament, but also in Paul's writings. And we'll talk a little bit biographically about them.
Great.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Profiles and Issues. Our issue is women in the New Testament, and joining us is Sister Lisa Marie. When we took a break, we were talking about the wonderful story of the wedding feast at Cana. There's so many wonderful examples of women's roles in the life of humanity and in the life of the church. Let's specifically talk about some of those women that are found in Paul's writings. Mention a few of them and give us a little background.
Okay, well, Throughout Paul's writings, you find references to women, and he's writing to a congregation of people who know these women, and so that makes it safe because they know them. And so, for example, Phoebe. Phoebe is mentioned in Romans 16:1, and from the context, what we think is going on is that she's a businesswoman, and because he mentions that she is his patron. That would imply that she is funding some of his missionary expenses. And so she's going to Rome as a businesswoman, and she's bringing this letter to the Romans with her. That's what that entire context would imply. But he also calls her a deacon. And he uses the Greek word diakonos. He doesn't use the feminine form of the word, but a masculine word. And what we know now, what we've known actually just from within the last 30 years, 20 to 30 years from archaeological excavations, is that when a masculine word is applied to a woman, that suggests an office. And so this would suggest to us that diakonos at this early point is an office. We don't know what is implied. But whatever the deacons are that are mentioned in Paul's letter to the Philippians, in Philippians 1:1, that also Phoebe was in Romans 16:1. Whatever that means, like I say, we don't know what it means at this early point, because we do know that the role will develop over the centuries. But the fact that she's a deacon and a prostatis, a patron, indicates that she had a special contribution to make in the church at Cenchreae, and also in regard to Paul's own ministries, and that he encouraged and benefited from her own ministry of leadership.
Another woman that is found in Acts of the Apostles who was a prominent woman is Lydia.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So Lydia represents the women that we know from the archaeological record. What is really fascinating is that only in Paul's letters and only in Acts do we find in the literary record of the Greco-Roman world these women with this kind of prominence, businesswomen. Outside of the New Testament, you look in the literary record and you don't see that at all. You have to look for it in archaeological digs, in inscriptions. And so Lydia would represent, again, just like Phoebe, who would be a businesswoman, Lydia also represents the businesswomen known from archaeology of the mid-1st century. And what do I mean by that? When Acts speaks of Lydia, it tells us that she and her whole household together are baptized. Now, what does that imply? We know from Plutarch that a wife was supposed to take on the same gods as her husband. And so she makes this decision for baptism, and it's her household that's mentioned. She and her household are baptized. That implies that there is not a man in this household and that she is independent. She is free and able to make this decision for herself. But what we know from the context of the time, that would not be the case if she were married. Unless her husband also became a believer, there would be a huge amount of strain and tension. Now, I'm not saying that this didn't happen, because we do know that there was strain and tension when women would become part of this early Christian movement against their husbands' wishes. But we only know that from post-New Testament sources. So implied here is that Lydia functions autonomously, and she may be one of those widows. The text tells us that she was a God-fearer or a worshiper of God. That would imply that her husband was a Gentile, and that she also was a Gentile, but that her husband was a Gentile God-fearer, and that she now is a widow. Because the whole context is she is connected to a house of prayer by a river, and that's where Paul goes on Sabbath, and so that would speak of a very Jewish context. But the fact that she's called one who was a worshiper of God, or closer to the Greek text, one who reverenced God, that implies she was not a Jew herself.
Let's talk about Priscilla. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about her?
Well, Priscilla and Aquila are a husband and wife team. When Paul mentions them in Romans 16, he mentions Priscilla by name first, which is unusual. We would expect the husband to be mentioned first, but no, he mentions Priscilla first here in this case. They have a very prominent role in the early church. They seem to be connected to Paul's mission in Ephesus, and when he writes to the Corinthian community, they know of Prisca, as she's spoken about there, and also in Romans. She's Priscilla in Acts, but she's Prisca in Paul's letters, which is a more formal version of the name. Priscilla is like dear Prisca. It's a diminutive form of the word. And so they have a house church in Corinth, and now he's writing to Romans, and they seem to have a house church there, and so they get around. What we think is going on is they might have been part of the very earliest Jewish Christian community known to us from the sources from the Roman historians themselves, who speak of a Jewish Christian community in the 40s of the first century in Rome, and that they were driven out by the emperor at the time. And so what we think happened with Prisca and Aquila is that they were driven out from Rome. They went to Ephesus. There they got to know Paul, but they also had some connections. They were tent makers, and so they probably had business dealings in Corinth. But then here we see them back in Rome now with another house church.
Some of the other very familiar names of women in the New Testament can be found during the crucifixion and the Passion narratives. Right. The women that were with Mary at the cross.
That's right.
Explain some of who they were and what their relationship to her was.
Well, how about Mary of Clopas, mentioned in John's Gospel in John 19? Who is this Mary of Clopas? Well, Luke talks about Cleophas as one of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And Cleophas would be another way to transliterate into Greek the original Semitic, whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic, Clopas. Okay, so we think that it could be the same name. Notice, though, how Luke does not mention the disciple with Cleophas on the way to Emmaus. So one of them, Cleophas by name, and it doesn't tell us who the other is. And so it could very well be that this other is actually his wife. Now, why won't Luke mention her by name? It could be, I mean, there are different reasons to account for this. It could be that the original source that Luke uses might have known her, and she might still have been alive, because we know that Luke uses early sources, and then he includes them in his gospel. That would be one way. And so you're not going to mention the name of a woman who's still alive unless it's a safe context, like Paul writing to his churches. That's a safe context. That would be acceptable. But the other possibility is that Luke wants to present two witnesses to the resurrection, and he knows darn well that a woman witness is not going to be acceptable for a number of reasons. But the credibility of a woman as witness was not seen as valuable as that of a man, and so he has his two witnesses here, with only mentioning one by name. And that makes then the Mary Magdalene story very significant as it gets developed and given great detail in John's Gospel. So what John is doing with Mary Magdalene in developing that story is Magdalene being the first witness to the resurrection implies to us that this is a true story. If you are going to invent the story of the resurrection, you will not make the initial witnesses women. You are going to invent them as men. And so the fact that the women are mentioned by the gospel writers as the earliest witnesses to the resurrection suggests the veracity of the story. The unlikeliness of women witnesses is striking. We see this in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, when Paul gives a list of witnesses to the risen Jesus. There are no names of women mentioned. Again, there might be a number of reasons for that, but one reason might be that he knows the credibility of women witnesses won't count and so don't even mention them. But another reason might be out of a sense of respect and a desire to protect the women from unwanted male attention.
We're down to the last couple minutes of our time together. Why, and I probably know the answer to this question, but why is it significant for someone like Paul to include women in this whole ministry? And because it was a very male-dominated church early on.
Well, here's what we want to say. Not so much, male. I would really wonder if it's a male-dominated church early on. It is a male-dominated world, and when we look at the culture of the time, that would be so for practical reasons. But for example, go back to Acts 16, the story of Lydia. And what you see there, who are these people at Philippi? These are all women. So when Paul goes to the house of prayer at the side of the river, they're all women there. I thought that, well, isn't this interesting? And so, he will evangelize the women. I think what's going on here is this whole other concept of nature that Paul is learning from baptism. Paul teaches that with baptism we are given a new nature, a Christ nature. Now, outside of Paul, what we know in the world at that time, they read Aristotle very devotedly. Aristotle has a huge influence, even in the first century AD. And Aristotle taught, he's used again by the Roman emperors at the time in their legislation on marriage. And Aristotle taught that some are born to rule and others to be ruled. Men are born to rule and women are born to be ruled. And this is a fact of nature. This is how we are by nature. And what Paul sees is that we are all given a Christ nature. And that Christ nature is given equally to everyone. And now there are different gifts, he says, but of course the same Spirit. And I think that's why Paul sees women in a completely different way. First of all, they're the most receptive to his message. And we see that time and time again. As we read Acts, for example, and as we read the Gospels, we see that being reflected, how women are the most receptive to Jesus. Luke also will bring this out in different ways. So they are there, but they're there in such a way as the culture saw fit to protect women in the literary record. But they're there nonetheless. And their role as witnesses and as leaders is respected. Junia, for example, in Romans 16 is called an apostle. Which brings up all sorts of questions, So we know that Paul, when he uses the word apostle, he means it in a very broad sense. And only much later in time will that word apostle become limited to just the 12 who were with Jesus. But women do have this role, and Paul benefits from their contributions to his churches.
Well, Sister Elise Marie Belts, thank you so much for being with us. I would love to continue our discussion, but we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was delighted.
Thanks for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Profiles and Issues was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Corda.